I think, we should just go ahead and jump right into this. I mean, because I know we have a lot of really good stuff to talk about. Paige and Lauren, can we talk a little bit about the old, idea of like asking for a prenup seemed so scary. And I mean, it seems that trends in marriage are changing. The millennial set, who is kind of we're right in that wheelhouse of the millennials either starting to get married or maybe they've entered into a marriage already. Why is prenups maybe not as taboo as it once was? Can we just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Lauren, do you want me to go first?
Go ahead.
A couple of things that just stand out immediately are that people are getting married much later in life, which often means that by the time they do that, they've established themselves professionally. Perhaps they already own a home in their own names. Perhaps they have significant retirement assets accumulated at that point. And those premarital assets are things that often get addressed in a prenup and what happens to those. And so we'll talk a little bit about what would happen if you didn't have a prenup and how that can be essentially changed by entering into your own agreement. But then there's also the case that millennials especially are managing their finances in a totally different way in the context of how they share responsibilities in the household. Has really shifted from predominantly having one primary breadwinner to now having two more relatively equal financial earners. And how does that get addressed even during the marriage? So a lot of times in prenups, you'll have provisions that don't only address what would happen upon separation, divorce, or even death, but also what the parties' intentions are, the couple's intentions during the marriage. Will they share expenses evenly? Will they deposit their income into a joint account? Will they do some, version of that half and half? And so those are things that are becoming much less taboo because, frankly, those conversations, I find the millennial or the younger generations are just having them more easily. They're having them when they're dating.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's it. One of the things that as I was preparing for this morning's talk, a bit of factoid that I found, which I thought was really interesting. And I kind of thought back to myself at this age. Back in 1965, the average age for women marrying was 21, and for men marrying, it was 23. Today, the average age for a woman is 29.2, and for a man, that's 30.9. The amount of retirement assets that I had actually established by the time from the age of 21, I was in my career for like 9 years by that point. And, it hadn't occurred to me, how much that money had actually really, and my husband is even older than me and he had even gotten that much more. And, there is a lot to be said for, I know you guys really want to talk about, Lauren, you and I were talking a little bit before about the best way to start with this is having the conversation, right? I want you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, as much I think as millennials and young people who are younger now are establishing themselves prior to getting married, there still is this taboo on having conversations with your partner about finances. I think, young people are getting savvier and smarter, and they're taking the proper steps to protect themselves. They're seeking out, advice from professionals who can point them in the right direction to do what they need to do for themselves. But they still are not taking that next step of having those conversations, before getting married. And we're finding that, young people today, and maybe it's the case that it's always been, don't really understand what marriage means, what marriage is. You know, there's obviously the romance and the love and the wanting to start a family. There's
And
all
the
of those.
wedding, right? They've
And the
made such
wedding.
an
Yes.
industry of the wedding that we forget about that the wedding leads to a marriage, right? And there's a lot of things that come with the marriage.
And they're not having those conversations prior to getting married, and you really need to have those conversations. And you know, one of the things that Julie and I were talking about in advance of this is, just because you broach the topic of prenup or you sit down and have that conversation with your partner doesn't mean that you'll need one, doesn't mean that it applies to you. That's what you're trying to figure out. I mean, if you sit down with your partner and you're both like, okay, neither of us really have established assets yet. We're going to be building a life together. We agree that everything each of us independently, individually earns during the marriage is going to be shared equally between us. Then, you know, a prenup might not be appropriate for you, but you have to have that conversation to kind of figure out whether it is appropriate or whether it isn't appropriate. And you're going to realize that during those conversations, other important topics are going to come up that you need to discuss in advance.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many different ways to have a family and build a life together. And you want to make sure that you and your partner are on the same page as to expectations of each other, you know, for what your obligations are going to be and what you're going to do for the partner and what they're going to do and give for you. And then you throw children into that. So it's really a conversation about, what is our financial future going to look like? What do we imagine our financial future to be like, you know, and from there you can kind of figure out if a prenup is something that you need.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I just want to, because another point that you had made earlier, Lauren, is that, and it ties into what we've already said, which is when you're getting married a little later, or if you've accumulated some assets through your career, a lot of clients think, and it sort of goes to the title of this talk, which is they don't realize that a prenup is appropriate for them. They're thinking, I'm going into this with nothing. I'm not from the ultra high net worth segment of society. But that is often not the case, right? Because what happens when you own a premarital house but you have a mortgage and you pay that mortgage with your spouse during the marriage? A lot of clients are confused about that portion of the value of the home, that is the equity in the home that is acquired during the marriage. That's now up for grabs just because it was purchased before the marriage, right? And so a lot of clients are surprised by that and surprised by how much a prenup can help them, and it's through those conversations with their future.
Well, I think it goes to that idea too of, you are amassing and probably not giving yourself as much credit for realizing that you've actually, in getting married later in life, you are amassing things that were not amassed before, whether it be a retirement or a house, or maybe you've made an investment in a business, become a partner, you know, like if you're a tech person who's received some bonus, or maybe what about like stock options for
exactly,
right? I mean, exactly. I think we take for granted the things that we have actually earned on our own volition. But I also like, Lauren, what you were talking about having the conversation, because one of the things we've talked about internally is the idea that, okay, there may not be a lot of assets there, but the idea is that you're both young professionals, maybe, right? And you're going to grow those assets, but maybe it could be the woman, but it could be the man. It could be somebody in the couple may say, regardless, I want to stay home, right? And how does that affect that early growth? And now suddenly one of you is staying home, and that even can be addressed, correct, in a prenup?
Absolutely. And if that is going to be the case, if you have conversations with your spouse, your partner, and you're going to have children, and you're in agreement that you want one of you to be home with that child, whomever it is, and that person is going to be the homemaker for, however long that you and your partner determine that that's appropriate. And the other partner takes on the responsibility of the breadwinner. You can and you should, put into that agreement to protect, the individual who was building assets and is temporarily no longer building them, to make sure that they, that you want to make sure that that partner that is the breadwinner appreciates the work that's going to be done at home and values that, because you have a lot of times, times get tough. A pandemic happens.
Yeah.
Like, who would have thought that was going to
Who
happen?
would have thought?
And the financial situation of the family becomes strained. So maybe you have the breadwinner now saying you're not contributing enough. When you have those conversations in advance and you make decisions together, one partner cannot lay that on you. And there's such value in just having the conversations, making the decisions together, laying out your expectations. And one of the things that, I mentioned before to I think it was both of you, continuing to have those conversations throughout the marriage. Like, financial conversations do not end with the prenup. That's not, they need to continue. And I know Paige has a lot of experience with this, but there's also provisions that can go into prenups, like such as sunset clauses. And, there's ways to protect, say the partner or spouse that isn't bringing in the same kind of income or building the assets in the same way that the other partner is. So I don't know if this is the time to speak on that, but if you want to, Paige, kind of explain what you can do in that respect.
Yeah, I think it's a great time to talk about sunset clauses. Look, if a couple of things that you said I want to touch upon, but I'll start there. So with the sunset clause, if you've got a 25-year marriage, that's sort of a common goalpost, right? Oftentimes, even perhaps before that, certain provisions will start to fall off. They terminate, right? So if you waive your right to spousal support, sometimes couples will do that just for the first 3 years or 5 years. And then after that, you can remain silent on the issue, and you do not have to come up with a set number at the time of negotiating the agreement. You can have a sunset clause that says this entire agreement goes away if we make it to a certain point in time. And I think you're right. A lot of people don't realize that, and especially the person who is not the one bringing up the prospect of getting the prenup, right? And they think that
they're being cut out, when in reality, you could equally be protecting yourself.
We've had a client that this particular client was so impressive. They were going into the marriage, and she was going into the marriage with significantly fewer assets than her fiance had. And they were, we were getting this agreement done. I would say it was probably like about 3 months before the wedding, which is usually a fine amount of time. And she was, doing all the things that you would normally think would totally turn someone off from wanting to deal with a prenup. She's getting her dress final fitted. They're going to the jeweler. They're finalizing all the plans. The invites have gone out. And that client was head and shoulders negotiating that contract. Like, well, what happens if we don't have this agreement? Well, you'd be entitled to XYZ. Well, I don't really think I want to take less than that. So then we would, and at the same time, she's, meeting the fiance to get in the car and go to the reception venue. At the same time, I'm, reaching out to his attorney saying, hey, we need to figure out what's going to work for both parties. And I could tell it was a catalyst for their relationship going into that marriage. The way that they approached it. And I think it's also important that the attorneys counsel clients, and we spend a lot of time doing this, understanding that this is not a threat to the integrity of your love. This is actually the healthiest, like a symptom that you want to see of a very healthy and balanced relationship. And I just think that if maybe we'll try to actually get that client to come speak to us. She might actually,
That'd be great. I think it would be fun to bring on a client who might be willing to talk about their experience for sure.
Yeah, and and I think just you need to think about the flip side. If you're feeling really anxious about this, is there something behind that you should really be exploring? And
I
how
love that point. That's an amazing, I mean, that is like such an amazing point, actually. Why is there that insecurity?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say if you're feeling that way, I mean, we offer free consultations because we want clients to feel comfortable reaching out and asking for help in thinking, even just thinking through these things. So if anyone's feeling that way, reach out to a professional, preferably a lawyer, who's going to tell you, oh, this is such a good thing. This is a great thing. We're going to take care of you and we're going to make sure that you are protected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Lauren, did you have something you want to touch on?
Yeah, just a quick point, because, I think Paige encompassed it. I just want to expand on it. Like marriage, you have to have the hard conversations. If you're unwilling to have hard and uncomfortable conversations during your marriage, it's going to be very problematic to having a happy and healthy marriage, because it's the most important relationship in your life, you know? So, and it may feel like a prenup is a hard conversation to have, or like the topic of prenup seems like I'm going into this with the idea that we'll break up. It's the financial conversations and decision and planning that you're doing, and you're being responsible for your children. It's going to protect them in the event that there is, in the unfortunate event that there is a divorce in the future. It will protect your family. I used to equate it, it's not exactly the same thing, to life insurance policies. Nobody gets life insurance policy because they want to die or they expect to die early. They get it to protect their families.
Yeah.
This is a similar, circumstance where you're going in and having these conversations, and you're talking about your financial future to protect your family, to protect each other. And that's a good way to talk. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Paige.
I want to just make a final point, and it just, again, like what you're saying, and we sort of talked about it earlier. Legal marriage does not have anything to do with protecting your love for each other. Legal marriage only speaks to your assets, how you will support yourself, and what will happen with the children. I mean, that's an oversimplification, right? There's nothing in there about how much you love each other. So, and I think, again, we're getting back to clients often not understanding what their rights and obligations are and how those change when you get married. And it's not just when you get divorced. I mean, when you get married, and it's interesting, there is no mechanism for making sure that people are educated on those things. And the beauty of a prenup is that you take control. Right now, if you don't have a prenup and you're going to get married, or even we can talk about postnups, which is just another thing for a prenup, but it's after you get married, you are giving away control of your future and how that gets determined to the legislators and the judge. And I think if I can just impress upon anyone who's listening, the power in a marital contract is that you get to control the terms of your future. And you are not farming that out to a third party who doesn't know you, doesn't know your family, doesn't know your interests, doesn't know your goals, and doesn't know how you care for each other.
I mean, excellent point. And
yeah, I just had to write that down because I'm going to make sure but actually the two things you each said that I want to make sure everybody listening is, it's like a life insurance policy. You don't go into a life insurance policy hoping you're going to die. So I love that analogy. That's a great analogy. But I also just love this point, is that it's a contract. If you control your future,
yeah,
that's all. Control your future. Don't leave it up to the judge down the road. Don't leave it up to, if you are in the unfortunate position that you decide the marriage isn't working, that you've both come to those terms, or you're in an angry place. If you've taken care of all this beforehand, you're in a much different mindset than down the road.
What was the statistic in the New York Times article? Now, 1 in 10 married couples are considering divorce
Yes.
after, I don't know if that's a constant statistic or if that's a post-quarantine or post-COVID.
Let me look that up. But while I look that up, I want to make sure that for the purposes of the audience that we do thoroughly cover some good examples of when you need a prenup, or not when, but I mean, we've covered that, but like inheritance, all of those aspects. And then I also want to make sure that I want to do almost like a little lightning round with you guys about what can be included in a prenup. Okay. So while you guys are talking about the use cases for prenups, I'm going to look up that statistic because I think it's important.
I can speak on the inheritance element of it. And actually that's a good way for us to also speak about postnups, because if you, in the event that, you and your partner didn't really have any assets and you didn't feel like a prenup was an appropriate thing for you to do before you got married. And then after you get married, you get an inheritance from one of the partners gets an inheritance from a family member, a house. You could at that point in time, contract and discuss what will happen with that inheritance and maybe enter into a postnup to protect that asset. Because if you commingle an inheritance with marital assets, again, your partner now has an interest in that asset. They have rights to that asset. It doesn't mean that they're going to get half of it because you didn't build it together necessarily, but they definitely have an interest in it, which can be used in a divorce strategically during negotiations. And it can just make it more complicated for you to get divorced because you now have this great asset. And it's hard to give an inheritance over to your spouse because it wasn't earned by the two of you during the marriage. It's a difficult thing. And we've seen, I handled a case in Brooklyn where a family, it wasn't even an inheritance. The mother was still alive, but they did some estate planning, and they changed the title of the house into two of their children's names. And one of the children was living in the house with their spouse and paying rent for 10 years to the parents. And there was an interest there. And, when the divorce occurred, it was something that had to be litigated. And when you're doing estate planning, for grandparents, for, the older generation, it's important to speak to a matrimonial attorney and make sure, to protect that. Because that would have been a great opportunity. We're going to do this estate planning. Postnup has to be signed. Spouses of the children have no interest in the property and in the early inheritance. And so inheritance is something that a prenup will always protect.
Yeah.
And you don't have to worry. You can say, we have this great beach house. We don't have to limit the time that we go there because we have to worry that, I'm commingling it. What does even commingling mean? You don't have to worry about any of those matters or issues down the road, protected from the get-go. I think that's...
Yeah, it's not insulting. It's just keep it, especially when there's death involved, people get all sorts of territorial, and if you can alleviate, I think that's a great point for down the road.
Eliminate the stress. You just don't have to worry about it, So...
And the example you gave, Lauren, is excellent because it sounds like in that case, there were siblings involved.
Yes.
Who had an interest in that piece of property that was probably not intended to be split 3 ways or more than 2 ways, or however many children there were.
Yeah.
And we talked about that in previous coffee talks. When you have business partners, right, and you're getting married, you have a duty to your business partners to have a prenuptial agreement. And because it's not necessarily the case that if you were to get divorced, your spouse then becomes an owner of your business, but it can seriously hinder your ability if you were looking to take investment, if you were looking to sell the business, whatever your exit strategy is, your growth strategy is. There's a due diligence process when you are a business owner, when you are looking to do those things, and they can ask you questions like, are you in a divorce proceeding? And that is a serious red flag. If you
Yeah.
are, you do not.
Well, and you talked about business partners, but I mean, what about just protecting your employees? Maybe you don't have a partner, but
Exactly.
I mean, your poor employee suddenly is getting dragged into your potential. I mean, it's just, I think that's,
It's what you want to, it's the worst thing that you want to avoid that at all costs. Yeah. Yeah.
what about
Wait,
second
Lauren wants
marriages?
to add something.
Oh,
Oh,
go
no,
ahead.
it's fine. Yeah, it's just in line with what you were saying. I mean, just with businesses, a prenup or a postnup is so important.
What about second
it ends up-
marriages?
yeah, second marriages. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. So quickly, what I would say about second marriages is, especially if you have children from the first marriage and you want assets that let's say you didn't have a prenup in the first marriage and you fought through a long legal process in a divorce to make sure that you were able to retain your equitable share of the marital estate, if you will, the marital assets. And now you want to make sure that those pass on to the children of that marriage. You like a prenup is a perfect example. And really, when we get back to talking about having the conversation, children of a prior marriage, employees, business partners, siblings, blame it on them.
Yeah.
Right? That's an easy out.
My mom won't let me go.
Yeah.
I tell my daughter that all the time. I'm like, you don't want to say you can't do it. You tell them I said you can't do it.
We've represented a client. I was telling you guys the story earlier. We've represented a client whose mother would not include him in the will if he did not have a prenup before he got married. And that is, I mean, that was a little less common because it was the mom who actually hired us to negotiate and get the deal done for them. But 100%, that client was telling his fiance, look, it's my mom. We just we have to get this done. I'm sorry, and that's fine. No problem.
Yeah. Other use cases that we want to make sure we cover. We talked about homes, retirement assets, pensions, right? Pensions are a big, I think in today's day, there's so many people who are now having 401ks, IRAs, all of that, but pensions are still used and pensions are very valuable. I know, Lauren, you know a lot about pensions.
Yeah, I mean, and it goes to the point that was made earlier, I think by everybody, that if you're getting married later or if it's your second marriage, I mean, you've already built this asset. So if you, and there are, with pensions, spouses are only entitled to a portion of it, that the marital portion of it. So from the time of the marriage, but at a lot of times when you're dividing up a pension, you can only do that once. So if you are married and say you're married for 10 years and you had been contributing to the pension for 10 years before that, and you're a hard worker, you're going to work another 10 years, another 20 years. If you, at the end of your first divorce, divide up that pension with that spouse, and then you get married and you're married for the rest of your life to that second spouse is not going to get, a piece of your pension when you pass away because you already.
Wow.
Yeah. So it can be very complicated. I was thinking when you were saying, because pensions can be a little bit more simple because there's equation that's applied, except not always, because there's these little nuanced issues that people don't know about. You can't give the right to survivorship to multiple spouses. I mean, there is the potential that that could change going forward as our lives change and our circumstances change and people have more than one ex-spouse, or
But right now,
the pensions are limited because, I mean, the pension, the companies don't want to be paying out multiple spouses,
Yeah.
we only paid out this pension until our employee was 75, but his first wife lives till 95, and the one after that lives to 105. They're paying out that pension for a long time.
Yeah.
It's just these little things, can be determined beforehand. and decided beforehand. So it's fair. So it's, you know, so
Yeah.
you control and not the court
Yeah.
and not the legislators. Like Paige said, that was a beautiful point.
Yeah. Stock options,
Mhm.
bonuses.
I mean, there's issues with when those get earned, when they vest, there's something interesting. You know, New York state law is an equitable distribution state. So, you know, we are not bound to 50-50 split once we determine who's gonna keep what and what will be shared. It does not have to be 50-50. So in terms of stock options, it could be that this is a part of my partner's compensation that I'm willing to forego, right? And what we would talk about is, okay, well, what are your intentions regarding, let's say, we touched upon this a little bit earlier. What are your intentions regarding raising children and having a family? Will either of you leave the workforce while the other one is accumulating significant wealth in deferred comp? And if you do that, you know, lifetime spousal support is really not a thing anymore.
Yeah.
Lauren, would you agree that like,
Oh, yeah.
some people have expectations that if they get married and have children and get divorced, and if they're not working while they're raising children, then they're going to be supported for the remainder of their lives, and that is not the case. So yeah, did you want to?
It's very, very rare. There has to be some sort of like debilitating disability, and there has to be the funds for it. It's just, I mean, it is, we have met with, I could, numerous, and it's mostly women who come in and are like, have this expectation that they're, you know, in their, you know, 50s, even late 40s sometimes, and they haven't been working. And we're like, oh, well, it's a, you know, it's 20-year marriage. You're going to get some spousal maintenance to get back on your feet, but it's temporary.
Yeah.
And it's between 10 and 30% of the length of the marriage. So it's not as long as people believe it is.
Well, I think, you know, something I wanted that came to mind as you both were talking was that, you know, with women earning more, even though we may not be earning the same on the dollar as men, we are earning more than we have in the past. And if we want to have that autonomy, women have to be more willing to have these conversations. Whereas in the past, maybe it was the man who was protecting himself. Women need to have the value in themselves to not be afraid to have these conversations, whether it's because they are going to decide to stay home, right?
Mhm.
And they want to protect, and they're going to leave their career for a period of time, or they're actually a top earner and they should feel like they can protect that money, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
Um,
If I could,
yeah.
one final comment. I wanted to offer, like, one of the things that we'll often suggest to clients is, in terms of spousal support, if you do intend to leave the workforce and that's what you want to do as a family, we will often suggest that if, God forbid, there's a separation event, then, you know, at minimum, spousal support will be for a period of time, an amount, in order for you to get another advanced degree, go back to school, rehabilitate yourself in the workforce, get the training, get the certification, get the licensing. And you don't have to, you don't have to know exactly what program you'd want to participate in to get yourself back up to where you were before you left the workforce. But you can say, you know, for a period of no less than 3-4 years, 2 years, whatever you think you might need to get rehabilitated, we'll often talk about what that could look like.
And I think that's a huge factor for women to keep in mind, that they don't have to, taking care of the children and deciding, you know what, it's mostly women, but it could be, I know more and more men are also staying home. This is about helping to take care of a family, knowing the value of what that does, while at the same time you may not be earning the assets that the other spouse is earning, and putting the value in what that is. So I'm sorry, Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to expand on that. And like, you know, a lot of times the person, you know, who's asking for the prenup or wants to have those conversations is the person that has more assets and more to protect. That's usually the dynamic. But here's an opportunity for the other partner to look at it. Okay, well, you know what, under the law, I'm not actually entitled to spousal maintenance for as long as I should be if I'm going to take off for this period of time. So if you have these conversations with your spouse and you say, you know, I'm not, yeah, you're right. Those assets are yours. I'm not
Right.
interested in them. But we have talked about when we have children, I'm going to be taking off for this period of time. And I think that we need to include something in there to protect me so that in the event that we do have a separation, you know, in the event we have a separation event, that I can be protected so that, you know, I can go out and get back on my feet financially, because I'm taking a hit to build our family, to do that for our family. We've agreed upon that. So I think it's an interesting, when you really sit down and you talk about what a prenup is and you talk about what goes into, you know, determining if you're going to have a prenup, if it's appropriate for you, and what provisions you would want included, you know, maybe you should think about the fact that there could be a provision that gives you more than what the law would give you. Because a lot of people think of it as, I'm going to get less than what I would be entitled to under the law. You're trying to prevent me from being able to get what I should be entitled to. And that's not what they're designed for. They can, you know, they can have provisions in them that give you more. So, and protect you in a
That's a
different
great
way.
point, that I don't think people always look at it as this, like, you're trying to take something away from me.
Yes.
Yeah.
When actually it could be giving something to you.
This is a moment. This is a real moment. And so I know we want to move on, but I want to just also offer one more example. It's not uncommon that we'll have a client come in who is not the spouse or the fiance who wants the prenup, right? But they're not going to object, right? Yeah. And so often the conversation is, oh, I just want to get this over with. I don't care. I don't want anything. And, you know, I'm fine with leaving with what I came in with, which is usually nothing, you know? And so I try not to laugh, right? Because there's just no way either of us are going to allow the client to walk out the door with that mentality, because that is not the case. I mean, we are the ones working with the clients on the other end no one says when they're in the divorce, I'm fine with walking away from everything. No one. Has anyone ever said? I mean, I've never heard that. Yeah. So in that
very,
moment,
very rarely, I think, does that actually happen? Does that actually
I've never heard anyone say that's happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll often tell the clients, okay, that's great. I love the sentiment, right? Obviously, this marriage is going to last forever. You guys are deeply in love, and that's beautiful. But now we're just going to let us, as your lawyers, take care of this other stuff for you and teach you what it is that is totally natural for you to expect without feeling as though you are, forgive me for using the term, but a gold digger.
Yeah. Okay, I'm cognizant of time, and I really want to cover a couple of things here. So, let's talk about what goes in a prenup. Lightning round. Okay. Division of assets.
Yes.
Okay. Can you talk about future spousal support? Yes, right? We talked about that.
Yes.
What about how I want my children to be schooled?
You can contract in agreements for, you know, anything. Custody, and that would fall into legal custody, right? How I want my children to be schooled is a major decision for children. So that falls under legal custody. And you definitely can contract for things, but the standard for children and what goes into the children is best interests. So you know, certain provisions are going to be unenforceable if they're not in the child's best interest. So if you put in there like a provision that says, regardless of our earnings at the time, we are going to enroll our children in, I can't even think off the top of my head, the best school in New York City.
Elon or something.
Yeah.
$50,000 a year for first grade.
And then you get divorced and there's no money to pay for that. You know, that's an unenforceable, unconscionable provision. So, you know, it's more, the prenups and the postnups are more asset focused and obligations that you have as a married couple to each other, right? Like spousal support is an obligation that you have to your spouse, not to your children.
Yeah.
Separate property is something that is defined in a prenup. Separate property and marital property. If you're coming in with separate property, you're going to want to say it's separate property.
Let's define a little bit separate property. We're talking about property as in homes, right? Property as in assets. What about, I want the record collection. What the record collection I came in with is the record collection I'm leaving with.
That's totally enforceable.
Yeah. But I will add, you have to submit, and attached to the back of the agreement is financial disclosures. So even tangible property that may not have an ascertainable value, if you want to protect it specifically, you've got to include it on that financial.
Okay.
disclosure. So we want the names of the albums and the singer and all of those things. But the same thing for we've had clients do that with jewelry and handbags and artwork and collectible items. Right. All of that stuff really should be listed out.
Listed.
Yeah. Sometimes artwork can be your biggest asset, your greatest asset. I mean, if you have a collection and if you've acquired that, prior to the marriage, or if you acquire it during the marriage with income that is considered separate property. So that's what you define in there, what separate property is. When you get married, from the marriage date onward, unless there is a prenup dictating something else, your income and your spouse's income are marital income. So anything, that's what Paige was talking about before when she was saying, if you have a separate property that you purchased before the marriage, but there's a mortgage on it and you're paying the mortgage from marital income, that's where the interest in that property comes from, because that marital income, and it could be not even your marital residence, like a beach house. They are, that spouse then has an interest in that property. And if you have in a prenup where you say, income is separate, all income earned individually by each party is separate, and then you have exceptions to that if, one of the spouses takes off from work for years,
right.
You can work all of that out and determine, and you decide what's marital and what's separate, not the courts, not, the legislator. So that is, the important.
Right. Is there anything else that we would want to make sure that people understand could be covered in a prenup? Have we missed anything?
Just in New York State, you cannot disinherit your spouse. Mm-hmm. So if you have provisions in your prenup that are specifically keeping certain assets separate, you will want to consider a provision that essentially waives your right to inherit from one another. You're waiving the protection that the law provides if your spouse were to disinherit you. So Julie, you asked earlier about if you have, if it's your second marriage and you have children from the previous marriage. If you, in your will, leave all of your assets to your children and you do not have a prenup or a postnup with a waiver from your spouse of their statutory right to inherit from you, then they can contest that will. And they have a legal right to a portion of your estate. Okay. And that becomes a nightmare for the family.
Yeah.
So that's a really important provision that you'd want to talk about.
And just to clarify for the people who are watching this who don't want to get divorced, or think that waiving that disinherits you, it doesn't. All you're doing is waiving your legal statutory right to inherit from your spouse. The will that you and the wills or the estate planning that you and your spouse, go and execute, that controls. So just because you're waiving your right to inherit doesn't mean you won't inherit, because the whole thing is that you and your partner control what happens in your financial future, not the laws of New York. You're taking that. You're kind of taking the state's ability to manage your relationship away from them and taking it back and giving it to you and your spouse. And that's who should have it.
Yeah, very true. All right, let's talk about for a second how we have these conversations. Actually, more than a second. I want to talk like, because these I think are tough conversations and can be scary conversations, but I think we've covered a lot. Like, these don't have to be scary, but maybe we could framework it, how you might broach it with in different scenarios. So I'm a 28, 29-year-old young career professional, female, and I am not really sure how to talk to my significant other about this. Where would I maybe start?
I think there's this myth that you have to be a bulldog about it. Oh, I'm of course I'm going to have a prenup. I would never get married without a prenup. And you have to establish that up front. And if you haven't established it up front, then you lost your opportunity to talk about it. And that's not the case. And in fact, I would suggest that you just sort of say what you said, Julie. It's like, hey, you need to have a really tough conversation, and this is this is uncomfortable. You could acknowledging those things up front is it really clears the way for your partner to see that this is coming from a place of it really is coming from a place of love. And if you can express like, this is hard, but it's important to me that we get through this together. So give your partner the opportunity to co-create this agreement with you, to take ownership of the process with you. And when you frame it that way, to say, look, I'm nervous, this is hard. And instead of saying something like, I just need a prenup, you might want to say, what's behind your need for a prenup? I just really want to have a discussion with you and an agreement in advance about what would happen when I inherit what I'm expecting to inherit from my folks, or whatever, fill in the blank.
It just occurred to me too, that I think it's important is that I know personally a lot of couples who manage their finances separately. And just because they managed them separately and they decided to go into the marriage saying that they were going to manage them separately, doesn't mean that they're legally seen as managed separately, right?
They aren't. Like, they aren't. All of that income that was earned by each of those the individuals is marital in the eyes of New York State. So any bonuses, it does, if you put that money into homes that you had purchased prior to the marriage, or family homes that, whatever, even if it's, a lot of our clients have no mortgages, they buy properties in cash.
Yeah.
But if the properties are being managed with marital money, then even if it's you have to pay taxes. And if you can't distinguish that came from separate property, like the taxes, if you did rooms over in the house and you upgraded the house, all of that, just because you keep your money separate, if you don't have a contract, prenup, a postnup saying that your income is separate property, separate income, it's not like, yeah.
And one of the things, sorry, Julie, I just want to say, title does not control, how title is held on the asset is not what we're looking at. In the context of a divorce.
Well, and so I think, and that's why the reason I brought that up is because I think that maybe in frameworking it if you're already having the conversation that you're going to keep your finances separate, this is just in addition to that. I mean, if you're willing to say, you're going to have your bank account and I'm going to have my bank account, then the next part of the conversation has to be about a prenup. You can't do this. You can't do that. You've actually taken, I personally know now that we're having, I'm like all of a sudden like, oh my God, light bulb. You've only taken a part of that step.
Correct. Yeah.
So,
and you're going to be surprised.
It will be ineffective, in the event there is a divorce down the road. It will not matter. The only thing is it's going to be more expensive for your divorce because you're going to have your attorneys have to go through all of both parties' assets and all of their bank accounts and where's the money coming from. We had a complicated case that we worked on where they hadn't been married for that long, but there was a hedge fund involved and there was a marital home that was actually purchased by the parents of one of the parties, and the wife was smart enough, it was the husband, to insist that her name be on the title. So it's very, and it kind of seemed when they got divorced, like the husband was blindsided by, like, she's going to get all this money. And it was a very, it was up in Westchester. It was over $2 million the house, and she got her share, because before getting married, they didn't have conversations about, who was contributing what, where that money was coming from. And it's so, I mean, I do think that generally, people who are extremely wealthy, high-end, like high net worth individuals and families do know to get prenups, but they don't always, especially like new money, where it's not something that was discussed or talked about in the past. And if you're marrying a savvy individual, that husband ended up very unhappy at the end of that divorce, so,
Yeah.
I think sometimes wealth can creep up on people. I mean,
yeah.
they may not realize it. So, we are actually spent a lot of time talking about this.
Yeah.
Okay. It is interesting, and
it's an interesting topic. I don't know. I really kind of got into this, and I appreciate everybody who's been watching. We've had a number of people coming on and off on Facebook, and we've got our participants. If anybody has any questions they'd like to ask, please shoot them our way, whether it's direct messaging us through our Facebook account or going to our website, or if you'd like to still, if anybody has a question that they'd like to pop in before we wrap this up.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you feel like we haven't covered that you want to make sure it gets said, either of you?
Oh, well, it would probably open up a whole nother 20-minute discussion, but we can do this again.
Yeah.
Sure. We can do that.
I would just say to people, don't be afraid to find out and educate yourself about things that you don't have the knowledge base for, or there's no reason for people to know about what prenups or postnups mean, or whether they're something that you would need in your life. So don't be afraid to go find out about it, and to make an informed decision as to whether or not it would be appropriate for you and your family.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid of attorneys' fees. There are attorneys out there who have, fair and reasonable fees. And,
I'm going to tell you, if you're worrying about getting a prenup, but you're spending, $6,000 on a wedding dress, you might want to think about, the priority, because the wedding dress is a one-day thing. The prenup will last you the entire marriage. So I think that's what, it's about, thinking about the priorities and not just about that wedding day.
Yeah. One last final detail on the point of fees. And I just want to say, Lauren, I think it's so liberating what you said about, you are not expected to know these things. Don't be afraid to ask. And just the final thought is, if your fiance, if you are the one who wants the prenup, and you have the means, your fiance is entitled and should always have independent legal counsel. That does not mean that you can't help out with the legal fees to get this done. And often that is another thing to talk about in the beginning of the conversation as you're broaching the topic. Like, this is not going to cost you anything. I'm happy to take care of the legal fees. Or tell your spouse the vice versa. I don't want to pay for this. I will certainly meaningfully participate in getting this agreement done, and I'm in this with you, but I think that you should pay the legal fees. That's not an uncommon thing to happen, and that does not compromise the independence of the counsel that you receive. The person who is paying the fees should not be involved in selecting who that lawyer would be, right? So the independence, it really has to be true, but certainly, the cutting the check to help your partner out and to get this done in a way that is, not financially threatening is 100% common and okay.
And I think that, I mean, this should go without saying, but that prenups are, you know, for all couples, all couples.
Yeah.
And
You don't have to have assets.
yeah. And well, and I say all couples, we're not just, if LGBTQ, anybody, you know, it's not just men. It's, because I know we've serviced a number of same-sex couples, you know, and they come and this is everybody. You got money to protect. It's love. It's about love for one another in the long term. And this is actually, I mean, the more I'm talking about it, I'm like, wow, like this is actually very powerful.
It is. I know I'm supposed to stop. One thing about same-sex couples, because their legal right to marry is only something that was recently enacted, often you have a lot of couples who've cohabitated together for a significant period of time before they get married. And that period of time, there is no common law marriage in New York State. So that period of time where you are not legally married means nothing in terms of the assets and the wealth that you've accumulated as one unified economic unit.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so a prenup is very relevant for those couples because they often want to then include that wealth that accumulated during that cohabiting period.
Oh, and that's really interesting.
Yeah.
We need to talk about that. That's another topic.
And that is another top example of adding, like, you know, how people think prenups take away. There are so many situations where they give each partner more protection. You know, you know, because you can contract and say that those previous years, you know, 10 years, 15 years, it could be that much. We've seen it. That counts towards
We're doing a topic. We're going to do one of these on things for same-sex couples to think about. That's an amazing point. So ladies, this was a good one.
Yeah.
I liked it. Got into this. This is a good topic. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And we will be back in 2 weeks, September 10th. And we are going to be talking about narcissistic personalities, well-being, right after divorce.
Yeah, you know, dealing with some very, very difficult personality issues in divorce, and coming out of divorce with. We'll have a special guest who has coined the phrase "the epic comeback," and so, you know, really coming out of divorce with a new outlook on life, a new way to manage yourself, your emotions, your relationships, your interactions with people, and especially in the context where you're going to still have to co-parent with the spouse that you're breaking free from. So that'll be a really intense one.
Yeah.
Well, this was fun once again. Thank you, everybody. We'll be posting it to our website and on our YouTube channel.
All right.
Talk soon.
Nice.
Bye.